Welcome back. This is actually, try to stick with me here. Ready? We're on like week 7 of the Plato's Cave series, but we're in week 2. So that's right. A series within a series, the kindness, goodness, mini series within the main series. If you haven't caught up, let me just, at a glance, I'll go to a 30,000 flyover real quick. We're trying to decide, or trying to sort of unpack or investigate what is the most real and what is the most important about life. Of all the things that can distract us, of all the things that get our attention, of all the things that we spend time and money on, what's the most important, what is the most real, what is the best example of what it means to live life. And the Bible is full of examples that would indicate that wisdom outranks conquering, that the love of wisdom ranks higher on that scale than the love of conquering. And yet we live submerged in a culture. When you look outside the church, when you look into the world, sometimes even into churches, what you find is that conquering is the ultimate reward. That's the thing that we have as a culture embodied. And we said it's the most important to conquer. If you want to know what that looks like, actually, if we're to try to hold ourselves accountable, what that would look like even within a church is to say that the size of the church or the numbers of the church or the income of the church is the most important element. That's what it looks like when conquering overwhelms wisdom. And it's easy to do. Listen, it's easy to do. It's actually when you start to investigate how much of my life is ruled by conquering versus wisdom, it's a hard thing to face. But we're in week 2 of the mini series and the main series. We're a little series and a big series. Take that, Billy Graham. I'm just kidding. Maybe he did that. I don't know. We looked last week at the law of goodness, the justice that's held in goodness, that God instructs his people, the followers of Jesus, that we are called to the law of goodness. Whether our country requires goodness or not, to follow Jesus requires the justice of goodness, to give value and dignity to the poorest corners of our society, and that the heart of the spirit of kindness that exists in that. So it's the law of goodness, the spirit of kindness. That was last week. We're actually continuing that exact same, trying to continue that, finish that, wrap that up this week. The law of goodness is the willingness to take a loss. It's hard to accept a loss when you love conquering the most. It's hard to accept a willful loss to the benefit of others whenever conquering is the most important thing in your life. But if you do that, it's so much easier to pat yourself on the back to then show kindness to the people that are benefiting. It's a challenge. It's a hard sermon. If you haven't watched last week, go back. 2 points this week. It's a 4-point series. First 2 points, the law of goodness, the spirit of kindness. This week is the balance and the embodiment. If you're taking notes, the balance and the embodiment. Start with the balance. When you look at the story of Ruth, Ruth was poor, underrepresented, a foreigner, a woman, a widow, all the things that gave her no power in her culture. That's where Ruth was. And she found herself being protected and provided for by Boaz, who is this wealthy person within the culture. So it would make a great movie, actually. It's this defenseless young person who's been sort of pushed to the parameters, the marginalized, and someone who has the ability to act on her behalf, who is not only acting on her behalf, but is showing her kindness in the process. I want to pick back up. This is at verse 10. It says, at this, after Boaz not only provides for her, but also shows her kindness, at this, she bowed with her face to the ground, and she asked, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Last week, we talked about being wealthy or being rich. We live in a rich nation. We live in a powerful country on the globe at a time where, and throughout history, we live like kings. We live actually better than the kings lived hundreds of years ago today, even our poorest. One of the biggest problems that we have in our country amongst the poverty is obesity. We don't understand the wealth that we experience as a nation, but we've made heroes. If I could hold our country accountable for something, then the culture that lives outside of the church, as we're trying to decide what does it mean to follow Jesus, when you look at the culture outside the church, we have made heroes out of the dispossessed. This is the difference between the culture that Ruth found herself in and the country that we find ourselves living in now. It's almost as though we want to make the wealthy or the successful the bad guys. They're instantly the villains. If you're dispossessed, if you're poor, if you're marginalized, you must be virtuous. That by virtue of being poor and dispossessed, that means that you must be high in virtue, and that anybody who's had any amount of success, that they must have somehow cheated. we expect kindness from the rich to the poor, but we don't expect in our culture that if you're poor, if you're on the poor or the marginalized area of this country, we don't expect that you should be kind to the rich. We promote an imbalanced kindness, a kindness that only flows downhill. We never talk about a kindness that flows back uphill. And that's what is so frustrating and so challenging about the gospel, is that the Bible doesn't care what our culture teaches. It teaches what it teaches. It holds us accountable to what it teaches. If we follow Jesus, this is what is there, and it doesn't sway too far this way, but it doesn't sway too far that way either. We promote an imbalanced kindness by deciding who deserves it. Who deserves the kindness? History lesson for a second. Let's stop. We're going to set the Bible history down for just a second. Let's just pick up our own history. You can look this up. In the 30s, when Stalin was ready to starve millions of people literally to death, literally starve millions of people to death, here's what he did. He wanted collectivist farming. He wanted the farming to be basically overseen by the government, by the establishment. He wanted control of the farming. He wanted to decide the food rations. He wanted to be in control of the people. He wanted to be in control of the food supply. And he wanted to eliminate the independent, I'm quoting here, you can look this all up. It's in your own history book, so you can go look it up. The independent-minded Ukrainians. He saw them as a threat. He didn't think they were of value to his regime or what he wanted to accomplish. So he wanted two things. He wanted collectivist farming, and he wanted to eliminate independent-minded Ukrainians. Here's how he decided to go about it. This is Stalin. This is one of the all-time boo hiss figures in all of history. And so what he did is he goes into these places and he starts a campaign. It was a kind of an information attack that said, "Oh my gosh, you guys, you're so poor. Bless your hearts." And they're like, "Yeah, we are kind of poor. You're dispossessed. Yeah, we are kind of dispossessed. You deserve a better life." You know what? We kind of do deserve a better life. And he labels the successful farmers the gulags. Kulaks, if you want to Google it. And he starts talking about how if they're successful, if those people are successful, they must have cheated. They must be bending the rules, not like you honest poor people, not like the honest poor people that are down here and down on their luck. You're not like those wealthy farmers that have had too much imbalanced amount of success. Just the Pareto distribution, Google it. But he's saying they must have cheated. The only way they could have been this successful. And so he drives out the successful farmers. And by allowing the poor people to judge the successful people, he drives the successful people out and effectively starves 3.9, possibly more, million people to death. In 1988, the U.S. finally ruled it a genocide, which is an intentional act of mass murder. We don't expect that kindness ever travels uphill. Because so many times when you look at wealth, it is, if you were to give rich a definition, it's anybody who's doing better than you. And so what we see is in the Bible, what's taught, we don't see anywhere that the Bible's saying, and those rich people, boo, those rich people. It's not like us, the poor people. I can't tell you how many people I know. One person comes to mind. I won't say names, but I could. I can't tell you how many times in my life where people look at how poor they are and they decided that because I'm not like those rich people, I must be righteous. It's a false premise. I'm poor, I must be good. I must be good. Jesus talked about loving the poor and this and this. So I'm poor, I must be good. Well, I'm not like that. It's as though we've assigned salvation to poverty, that if you want to be a good person, all you got to do is be poor. It's a coping mechanism, and I'm not saying I don't understand how people get there, but the problem is we don't see that in the Bible. We don't see that the Bible's teaching that as long as you're poor, you're okay. Isn't that frustrating? Isn't it? It's so much easier to go, you're rich, you need to be kind to the poor, and yet we turn right around and what we see is the Bible teaching that even if you're poor, kindness to the rich. Nobody escapes. Remember last week I read the prayer of the Pharisee that goes, I'll just read it to you. Luke 18, verse 9. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told the parable, confident of their own righteousness, and they look, keep in mind, you can be poor and look down on the rich. This is very anti-cultural. What I'm talking about is very anti-cultural. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other tax collector. The Pharisee stood by And himself prayed, thank God that I'm not like these other people, the robbers, the evildoers, the adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all that I get. Keep in mind, that could be the rich Pharisee looking down on the poor people, but it also mentions the tax collector, which means Jesus is giving the example of a Pharisee looking to someone who is more wealthy than him and going, thank God I'm not like him. I must be good. It's a frustrating balance, isn't it? The balance of kindness and goodness. The truth is, if you're operating in self-righteousness, and self-righteousness is always an insult, but self-justification, self-goodness, if you are writing yourself in as, well, I must be good, I am poor, the fruit of self-righteousness is never kindness to those that you oppose. You can be just as ugly and just as mean-spirited to people who are rich if you're poor as you can if you're rich to people who are poor. It's so easy for rich people to be like, well, if they just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and do what I did, but it's just as easy for people who are poor to be like, you don't understand us, you're rich, you don't have the same problems we have. Ruth sees that Boaz is being kind, and she doesn't say, well, yeah, that's the rules. Look at Leviticus. You owe me the corners. And she could have, according to the law, she could have held Boaz to task. She could have held anybody to task, but she didn't carry any power. It would have gotten her nowhere appealing to the law. She recognizes that Boaz is operating in kindness, and she appreciates that she's being included in that. You want to hear something that's really painful to say and probably going to be even more painful to hear? Poor Christians are not excluded from the fruits of the Spirit. It doesn't say, this is the life, this is what's produced in the life of the Christians, except if you're poor, it's okay because you're poor, so you just do the best you can. It says the poorest among you get to live in the same spirit of kindness and goodness as the people who are wealthy. And in fact, when the Pharisee is talking to the tax collector, he is holding himself in, ready for this? I am superior to that rich person because I do this. It's no different than somebody going, I'm rich and I'm superior to them because they're poor. There's no difference. Matthew chapter 5, this is the Sermon on the Mount. It's the most famous sermon that Jesus preaches, and it starts with this. Ready? Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside, the mount, and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said this, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It doesn't say blessed are the poor. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He starts the sermon with blessed are those who realize that they live in the corners. They are the recipient. They are the benefit of living in the corners, of kindness that was given to them that they were not able to provide for themselves. And that doesn't mean that you're poor or you're rich. It's saying blessed are those who in their spirit don't feel like their own actions have justified them. Do you realize how difficult this is? Do you realize how countercultural what I'm preaching right now is? That you can be rich and feel superior and it makes you a bad guy, but you can also be poor and feel like that makes you superior and that you're a bad. And the Bible says, blessed are those who don't feel like their own actions have justified them, the poor in spirit. The completion of that prayer of the Pharisee is this. It says, but the tax collector, historically very wealthy, stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. This is a guy who would have been the harvester. He wasn't financially living on the corners of charity. It says, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. What does this mean? Don't you just hate it when you meet somebody who's more successful than you and they're nice? They're like likable and you're like, oh, I'm a good person. Good for you. It's so much easier when you meet a successful person, they're unlikable and you're like, I don't even want to be like you. It says this tax collector goes, I can't. I'm sorry. He's not operating as though he is able to justify himself. Boy, you want to talk about feeling exposed. There is nothing that leaves you feeling more exposed than when you accept that you have nothing valuable to trade. We love having something valuable to trade. Well, this is what makes me important. In fact, in the U.S., one of the things that we get to operate, and one of the things that we can trade is, well, I have been intersectionally marginalized. That's what makes me good. And you're like, wait, what? The only way that makes us good is if you live under a law that gives precedence to that. I'm not saying that people don't have it bad. Listen, I'm not saying that people don't have it bad in the U.S. I know that they do. I know there's people that have been marginalized. I know there's people that have had it bad. I know that not all ground is created level. I get that. But what I'm saying is when you appeal to that for your own righteousness, you're appealing to the law, not to the Spirit of God. Okay, let's keep going. When you look at David, This is 2 Samuel chapter 9. Remember David, King David in the Old Testament, he was a man after God's own heart. He wanted to embody what it meant to follow Jesus. And he called him, it was God back then before he knew who Jesus was going to be. But he didn't get it right. He got a lot of it wrong, actually. But you can tell his heart is to serve God. And so after, and I've told this story a million times, it's about Mephibosheth, and you already do your own research if you want to, but David pulls in the descendants of the former king that he probably would have, under every legal parameter, could have had everybody in Saul's family put to death. But instead of putting to death the people who deserved it, justice, he instead pulls in Mephibosheth, who he owed death, but instead gave mercy. Do you see the intersection of the cross of justice and mercy that we talked about last week? That David is actually demonstrating the nature of Jesus in the Old Testament. It says, "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan." The spirit of kindness says, not only am I going to be nice to you, I'm going to treat you as though you deserve it. Not only am I going to operate in goodness, I'm also going to operate in kindness. "I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth, ready? Could have said, "It's rightfully mine. It was mine before it was yours. I deserve this. I'm owed this. You're just one of those typical rich people. You're just one of those rich people who think you own everybody. You're just one of those rich people that pulls up in your nice car." I'm going to tell you, there's almost nothing worse than somebody who feels like they're justified because of how poor they are, talking to somebody who is evil because they're rich. I mean, it is an ugliness that I don't like. I also don't like when people who are rich are ugly to people who are poor. I don't like either one of them. Mephibosheth could have said, "Yeah, you stole that from my family. That was my land and you took it, colonizer." Instead, Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" What he says is, why are you being kind to me when you don't have to be? Like I said, there's nothing that makes you feel more exposed than realizing you have nothing to trade. Shaming people, for the record, is not currency. The ability to shame someone is not currency. We treat it like it is because it's 2021 and we're all just jacked up. But the truth is, sometimes there are people that are in a position of power over people in a position who aren't. We don't recognize that because we're taught that in America we're all equal. We do a good job of that. But the reality is, throughout history, there have been people who have been in unfairly advantaged places that have ruled over people who are unfairly disadvantaged, and there was nothing those people could do about it. It wasn't the law that compelled David, it was the spirit of kindness. If we want to look at the embodiment of kindness, what it means to be kind and what it means to be good, if we want to try to put that into a package that's understandable. When you look at Mephibosheth and Ruth, both when they're face to face with unearned kindness, Mephibosheth and Ruth are both given unearned kindness, deserved because of who they are, because they're people, but unearned. They didn't do anything spectacular to earn this kindness from people in power. When they are met with unearned kindness, they become aware of their own deficiency. That's what it means. That's what it means to be met with power and preference. There's this sense of awe. I think sometimes people haven't experienced awe because they've never really been around power. How many times do you know people who are like, "Well, I'll tell you what I'd say if I ever met so-and-so," and then they actually get to meet that person, like, "Oh, I've always been a big fan." Awe of like, "Oh man, you're someone in power and recognizing me and loving me." If you look at, and I've told this story before, but you look at the story of Jesus, he's interacting with Peter, and Peter's not grasping the magnitude of who Jesus is. They go fishing, and as they're pulling in this catch of fish, logic would say that Peter, a fisherman, would look at Jesus and go, "I hit the lottery. You can catch fish? Are you kidding me? This is great. Will you stick around? Will you help me?" You would think logically that would have been the response from Peter, but Peter doesn't have that reaction. Peter realizes he is dealing with a power that he hadn't fully grasped. And he looks at Jesus, and instead of saying, "Jesus, will you be on our fishing team? We're going to kill at the bass tournaments." I'm from the South. "We're going to kill at the bass tournaments." Instead, he looks at Jesus and he says, "Away from me, for I am a sinful man." He realizes, I have nothing of value that I can trade you. That's what it means to have an encounter with Jesus, is you look at Jesus and you go, "I have nothing of value that I can trade. I can't trade the fact that I'm poor. I can't trade the fact that I'm rich. I can't trade the fact that I'm good or that I have nothing. I am nothing. That's what awe does, is it makes you feel very, very, very small and very, very, very valueless. Have you ever sat out at night and looked at the stars and realized the vastness of the universe, and all of a sudden you have this moment of like, I'm so little. There's a story in Daniel, and I won't get into the whole story, but the king is having this party, and he has brought in the elements from the old temple, and he is having this, it says his concubines are there, and it's just this hedonistic thing, and a hand appears and writes on the wall, and they bring in Daniel, and Daniel was in a secular job, but he was committed to God, and he comes in, and they ask him to interpret, because it's this moment nobody understands. It's this chaotic moment nobody gets, nobody understands. It's in Daniel chapter 5, verse 23. It says that as Daniel gets ready to interpret what's been written on the wall, he tells the king this. He said, "You praise the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone." What does that mean? Wealth and structure. You've praised the gods of wealth and structure. And then it says this, and I think this is such an important point. I really wish we could grasp what's being said here, is that you have pursued a God of security and wealth and structure and pleasure. You've pursued all these things. We go, yeah, those crazy old historic people, those ancient people and all their stupid beliefs. It's like it's just cyclical. When you look at what's been promised to bring happiness in our culture, it's like if you're famous enough, if you're wealthy enough, if you have enough of this or enough of that. And he says this. This is what he says. Daniel says this. He says, you've worshiped this, you've pursued this, you've given this your highest priority, which cannot see or hear or understand. You have pursued a God that cannot see, cannot hear, or cannot understand. It's an impersonal God. It's an impersonal idol. It's an impersonal, what we said is, will be the God, will be the important part. We will be the center of the universe. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hands. See what Daniel just did? Think about this. Try to, and I know we're kind of getting in the weeds, but God gives a human, it's called an anthropomorphization, the hands of God, the drawing mechanism of God, the thing that God has that we have, the things that allow us to understand the humanity of God. Daniel begins to paint God in human form so that we can better understand who God is. He gives God, with his words, he gives God hands, who holds in his hands your life and all your ways. He says, you've worshiped idols of wealth, status, self-goodness. I'm good because I'm a high producer, I'm rich, and I'm very effective, and I've got all these businesses, and I give all this money to the poor. Self-righteousness. Also, I'm poor. I'm not like those rich people. I'm just out here trying to do the best I can. Self-righteousness. Isn't that crazy? Both sides. It can go both ways. Daniel points to a God. There's no way Daniel understood what was going to happen. God begins to take human form through the words of Daniel. What Daniel is doing is he is pointing to a Jesus who would be born human, who sees and hears and understands, a God that we can grasp, the embodiment of kindness and goodness. God sent himself in human form so that we could understand what it looks like to live in goodness and kindness. The God of the universe, the power that we can't possibly understand, born to a poor family, the God who owns the harvest and the God who gleans in the corners of the field. There's nobody that can't look at Jesus and understand the humanity of a God who sees and hears and understands. God would send his son to the corners. And when Jesus got here, it wasn't just the law. Who's going to hold God accountable? Who's going to make God follow a law? The law is what God speaks. As God speaks, it becomes a law. So when Jesus shows up, he's not under some sort of restriction. So he could have shown up and go, I'm going to die for you guys, you idiots, you sinners, you terrible people who couldn't get it figured out. He doesn't. He shows up and he lives in kindness as he's about to fulfill the law. And his kindness wasn't just reserved. This is the amazing part. Ready for this? You're like, I don't know. What are you going to say? The kindness of Jesus wasn't just reserved for those who agreed with him. This is not to get into a debate, but the distinction that I see between Christianity and different religions is it says kindness to those who agree with you and war to those who disagree with you. And Jesus says kindness to those who agree with you and kindness to those who don't. We are held under the law of goodness to people from our nation and people who are not from our nation, people who are the Israelites, people who are not the Israelites, to the rich, to the poor. He's extending kindness. Listen to this. This is Luke 23. This is at the cross as Jesus is about to lay down his life in sacrifice on the intersection of mercy and justice. And it says, when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. And Jesus said this, the embodiment of goodness and kindness. He's about to give up his life on the cross of mercy and goodness. And listen to the heart of Jesus. Jesus said, Father, now keep in mind, Jesus said, if there's any other way, let's do that. But if not, willfully giving up his life for people who opposed him. See, Christian, see, Christ follower, see, church member. I think sometimes we're really good at reaching the people below us on the scale, or really good at reaching the people who believe like us. Jesus looks into the faces of people who were physically crucifying him and says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The next verse says, and they divided his clothes up by casting lots. What's he saying? What's Jesus saying when he says, Father, forgive them? As he looks to the people who oppose them, the maddest, the most angry, the give us Barabbas crowd, the people who are screaming in his face. He's saying, send my mercy and send my forgiveness clear out into the corners for the people who are the most spiritually poor. So even that those who oppose me have elements of my nature and my goodness, give it to the people even who oppose me. I think what we see in Ruth and Boaz is this unearned merit, this unearned goodness, this unearned kindness. And I think sometimes we forget that we are the recipients of an unearned mercy and kindness. What are we going to tell Jesus? Well, I did really good, but you also did bad. I think sometimes we feel like, well, we're a church, well, we follow Jesus, so that gives us an element of superiority. Christian, I'm telling you, if you follow Jesus at all, if you know the nature of Jesus at all, we are more like the tax collector going, forgive me, I'm a sinner. I didn't deserve it either. I myself reap the harvest in the corners. I myself am gleaning from the leftovers that I didn't earn. I didn't plant this. I didn't deserve this. I didn't earn this. But when I follow Jesus, I just get the sense that he likes me and that he loves me. And if he likes even me, he can like even you, whether you're doing better than me or whether you're doing worse than me. I can exhibit kindness because I know that I have been given things that I didn't earn, that I didn't deserve. That's what it means to exhibit the fruit of kindness and goodness in my life as I follow Jesus. That as Jesus is getting ready to lay down his life on the cross of goodness, the justice and the mercy, the kindness, he was thinking of me and he was saying, there's going to be times in Jordan's life where he thinks he's earned it or deserved it. There's going to be times in Jordan's life where he is the least likely person to deserve it. Forgive him, for he doesn't understand what he's doing. How could I ever get to a place in my life where as an imperfect person, I don't extend that same sort of grace and mercy even to people who oppose me, the people that I want to like the least, I'm held the most accountable to love. Let's pray. Lord, as we get ready to move into the rest of the service, into worship and the realization that, God, we've been granted mercy that we didn't earn. You call us forgiven because of the justice that you fulfilled for us on the cross. But God, even on the cross, you looked at the people that you were supposed to, by the world's standards, that you were supposed to hate the most, and you called forgiveness down on them. God, don't let us be people who look at people more successful than us and hate them and resent them because we also hate ourselves. God, let us not be people who hate ourselves at all. Let us see ourselves the way that you see us. God, help us to love ourselves and others the way that you have loved us. God, let us demonstrate the law of goodness and the spirit of kindness. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.